Okay, so welcome to the European Center for International Political Economy and our event, Making Friends in Times of Trouble, the EU and Mercosur relationship and the association agreement. My name is Oscar Guinea. I'm a senior economist at ECIPE, and I'm part of the ECIPE EU-Mercosur project. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce you to our three special guests today. First, Vanika Sharma, who is joining us from Delhi. Hi, Vanika. Vanika is a colleague of mine at ECIPE, where she works as a researcher on international trade, including EU and Mercosur relationships. Our second guest is María C. Latorre, who is Vice Dean for Research at the Faculty of Statistical Studies at the University Complutense of Madrid, and Director of the report Economic Impact of the EU-Mercosur Agreement, commissioned by the Spanish government. And finally, Elitsa Garnizova, Director of the Trade Policy Hub at the London School of Economics Consulting, and co-authored of the Sustainability Impact Assessment in support of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, which is the main analytical document published by the European Commission to weigh the cost and the benefits of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement. So welcome to all of you. If you would like to ask a question to any of our speakers, please write it in the chat function at any time, and we will try to ask as many questions as possible in the final part of this debate. We will also put links to the studies in the chat function and in our web, where the event will be hosted afterwards. Well, a lot of things have happened since we launched our ECIPE EU-Mercosur project 1 year ago. During this year, we have organized 5 events and published papers and blogs. While the agreement has not been ratified yet, our goal has been to keep the flame of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement alive, nurture it with evidence-based discussions and writings on the most important topics involving the two regions, the EU and Mercosur. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has given the EU-Mercosur relationship a new light. The association agreement offers opportunities to cement the EU-Mercosur relationship and to anchor it in the modern realities of trade and investment. Yet, the ratification of the agreement is not a done deal, as members of the European Parliament have questions about its environmental impact. Today's event is broken down in 3 themes. First, we want to offer the most accurate picture that describes the EU-Mercosur economic relationship. Then, we will discuss how the way we see these relationships have actually changed after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And finally, we will look at the cost and the benefits of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, and to what extent the agreement can support EU-Mercosur economic integration. So, in the EU-Mercosur debate, some goods like trade in sugar, soy, or chicken have taken a lot of space. However, the EU-Mercosur trade and investment relationship is more complex than that. Let me direct the first question to you, Maria. How would you describe the EU-Mercosur relationship? Which are the key sectors and the most important countries?
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking ECIPE for organizing this very interesting seminar. I feel I learned a lot of things here. And thank you, Oscar, especially to you, because I think you've been working on this. So I'm very happy to be here. Okay, now regarding your question, I think key sectors and key countries. I think there are some myths around that, and you mentioned a few, Oscar, already. Talking about countries, of course, usually larger countries account for a larger share in trade, and Brazil is a big part of the Mercosur side, no doubt about that. But if you look at the European side, for example, you maybe would be surprised by finding out that some countries such as the Netherlands, Belgium, countries that are not the largest in Europe, have very important relationships with these countries. So this is not a story only about the big European countries. And also, I think trade agreements in a way are a tool to give more room precisely to the smaller countries, because they really make it easier for them to have preferential access. And then what happens is that they can account for a larger share of trade. And this is what most of the studies on the EU-Mercosur agreement have found, that, for example, Paraguay and Uruguay would be among the countries that benefit the most. Coming to the products, I think if you read the press, you said that, Oscar, already, right? You feel this is about beef. And of course, I understand that we have an important thing here regarding the Amazonia, and we should be careful about it. And Europe has said that they want to add an addendum to the agreement to introduce safeguards related to the environment. So I think we are being cautious about that, also because the trade agreement has included quotas for agricultural products. But if you look at the data before the agreement, the ones we have now, I think it's important to make the point that services, depending on the year, are even larger than agricultural exports coming from Mercosur to Europe. I think sometimes that is not that clear, because we have the statistics on services are harder to deal with. And then we have the impression that it's all products, what we trade, but that's not true. In fact, in the latest years, services in this relationship coming from Mercosur have been growing much more than agricultural products. And to say the truth, the bulk is manufacturing. So it's not agriculture either, right? Let me point to just a final thing regarding investment, because these agreements are quite complex and they are not only about trade. I think that's another important thing we should highlight. And with foreign direct investment, these operations of multinationals and investment abroad and so on, you find the same patterns. You have some small countries that are conducting this FDI. And if you look at the products, the sectors in both directions, you find that Mercosur is investing more in software and information technologies, in business services, in financial services. And you would be surprised, because maybe you expect it should be agriculture, but that is not what we have in the data.
Well, it's a very good answer. Vanika, you have also written about the EU-Mercosur relationship in the 21st century. Would you agree with Maria's assessment? What do you think?
So first of all, again, thank you, Oscar, for organizing the event. And I'm very happy to be here with this great panel. And absolutely, I think what we found in our own study was also very similar to what Maria has said. And just adding to what Maria has said, I think it's often assumed that the trade relationship between EU and Mercosur has been made up of agriculture, and that's true. But that trade relationship is also changing, right? So there are more sophisticated products and services that are now being exchanged between Mercosur and EU, especially in services. And I think what we found was that business services, Mercosur exports of business services to the EU were actually much larger than Mercosur exports of sugar, soya, and beef in 2019. So that's an interesting point as well. And to again add on to what Maria said about the EU member countries that are trading with Mercosur, EU exports to the Mercosur are actually being led by countries such as Germany, France, and Italy, followed by what could be considered more traditional partners such as Spain and Portugal. And at the same time, when we look at trade per capita, it's actually smaller countries such as Denmark and Greece that also rise up in the rank. So I think it's important to note that when we're talking about the association agreement, that these new changes are being taken into account, and you know, that's how the agreement is being formulated.
Good. In the same paper that I just mentioned before, you have a nice quote, and so let me say it out loud. In trade, it takes two to tango. And since 2015, it's been China rather than the EU that had risen to become Mercosur's main trading partner. Can you tell us a bit about China in the EU-Mercosur relationship, how important China is for Mercosur, and how much of a competitor China is for the EU in Mercosur?
Yeah, so I think in addition to these two changes that are happening in the EU-Mercosur relationship, a third change is the rise of China, right? So, and this is important because since 2015, China has become Mercosur's main trading partner, overtaking the EU. So in fact, in 2019, Mercosur and China trade combined was 33 billion euros larger than EU-Mercosur trade. But I think this is something that was to be expected. China is a huge economic player. It's the factory of the world. So it was only natural that Mercosur and China would start trading, especially because China is such a big importer of raw materials and agricultural products that the Mercosur countries export. The problem for the EU related to China's rise then is that as China-Mercosur trade grows, it's going to eat up into the trade that is happening between EU and Mercosur. However, the good news for EU is that despite these changes, the EU has been able to maintain its position as the leading market for Mercosur's agricultural and industrial exports. And coming back to the first change, which was in the composition of trade between EU and Mercosur, because EU-Mercosur trade is growing into more sophisticated products. As China-Mercosur trade grows, it's going to eat less into EU-Mercosur trade because it's still in agricultural products and raw materials instead of more sophisticated products. At the same time, there are also other areas where China is catching up to the EU, especially in investment. China has been investing a lot in infrastructure in the Mercosur countries, and Mercosur has also been investing in China. The foreign direct investment is growing. And also in terms of global value chains, China has rapidly been adding more value to Mercosur exports. But in both of these areas, the EU still has the upper hand. For instance, what was surprising to me from our study was that the stock of EU FDI in Brazil is actually higher than the EU FDI stock in China and also in India. So even though China is quickly gaining ground, there are still several avenues open for EU-Mercosur relationship to expand and also to grow into newer sectors. Yeah, I think I will stop here.
Good. Elitsa, let me turn out to you. So you are one of the co-authors of the EU-Mercosur Sustainability Impact Assessment prepared for the European Commission, and you have spoken with civil society across both sides of the Atlantic. In your view, is there a gap between the individual perception of the EU-Mercosur relationship among stakeholders and the data? And what is that the data is not telling us that people with whom you have spoken feel strong about this?
Thank you so much, Oscar. And I want to say welcome to everyone today to this very interesting event. It's great to see so much interest in the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement. So first of all, let me tell the audience today that as part of our assessment, we actually gathered information and evidence through 3 different surveys, workshops in both Brazil and Argentina, 4 roundtables in Brussels, hundreds of interviews, and as well as numerous individual submissions sent directly to our team and to the European Commission. And I'll actually, amongst all of this, I'll never forget that arriving in Sao Paulo in 2018 for one of our first stakeholder meetings, the first comment I heard from a business association in Brazil was, "Why are you asking us about our opinion? This agreement is already happening." So this is to say that the perception, especially on the Mercosur side, was that there was a lot of impetus and a lot of support for the agreement to happen. And somehow, and I think especially now with time, we kind of see this more that there was a bit of a unique window of opportunity on both sides for the agreement to happen when it did and as it did. And it's not just because of course, the Mercosur side, but very much driven on the Mercosur side, and the fact that there were also a lot of structural changes happening in Mercosur already, regardless of this treaty. And Vanika and Maria already mentioned some of those things that are relevant to the EU. So the business community in Mercosur, I would say in particular, but also in the EU, I think on both sides, there was clarity that over the long term, the association agreement will have positive effects and it will be beneficial for both sides. But again, the key word here is the long term, and we all often as economists would make those distinctions, even though I'm not an economist, I wouldn't call myself one. But I would say that the individual perception was that there was a lot more to be done in the short term in terms of technical assistance, so need for assistance in the short term, and different for support for adjustments, different type of accountability measures, different other types of mitigating measures. So things that would help both sides to really smoothly transition into the agreement, but not just the agreement, as I said, wider structural changes. So the issues which were raised on both sides, I would say, wouldn't differ too much from any other agreement, particularly. We tend to these days to maybe a little bit exaggerate that the EU-Mercosur agreement is unique in some way, and it offers like sometimes of challenges that we don't see elsewhere, but it actually, some of the things are quite common. So we would hear a lot about the considerations for the impact on SMEs, so that we know that on both sides it's concerned that they'll be facing competitive pressures, again, the need for transition and for adjustment. A lot of horizontal issues that cut across different sectors, intellectual property rights, patents, but also things like geographical indications that are so important for the EU. The Mercosur agreement was one of the first to really bring to the fore the issue of animal welfare, and this is something that has been raised in a lot of other publications and events, just because it became quite prominent as one of the first both studies but also agreements to look at impact through that animal welfare lens. I would say that some of the specific concerns that we heard, you did already mention, and they're very much out there in the public domain with regards to, for example, the car industry in Brazil, machinery sector in Uruguay. And because of how the models work, it's really about, again, ensuring that there is upskilling transition, that there is some sort of mitigation for some of those immediate impacts. On the European side, we already know a lot about the quotas for beef, ethanol, and sugar. And as we know now that the agreement it has a text attached to it, which it didn't at the time when we worked on it. These fears are not matched by the final result, given that in our study, for example, the conservative scenarios that we looked at are much closer to the final outcomes. And I just want to reiterate something that both Vanika and Maria pointed to, very much something that should be praised more and spoken about more, just in terms of, again, feedback from stakeholders is, and again, maybe not Mercosur unique in that sense, it's really about the regulatory barriers to trade once again. So we are really about talking about how to make sure that operators from both sides have access to the financial insurance services sector, for example, how there could be greater regulatory harmonization or convergence for specific sector regulations, issues around licensing commitments, industry standards. So while we were really bogged down in talking about tariffs and TRQs, it's really stakeholders actually managed to look beyond this at different points and managed to tell us, so it is about creating a better regulatory environment on both sides and making sure that operators can access that as much as possible. So I just want to, for now, wrap it here, just because I think that was really the key point.
Good, and we will talk about the those regulatory barriers maybe at the end of the session. But before we go into that, let's turn into our second theme, right, which is the EU and Mercosur economic relationship after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Vanika, if one looks at the EU policy proposals on trade, they're all pretty defensive. Examples like the anti-coercion instrument, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the enforcement regulation, to say a few, will make it more difficult to export to the EU. Yet you have written that the EU needs to make more friends. So in your opinion, what's the balance between defensive and offensive trade policy in the EU at the moment? And what can the EU do to, let me just quote your latest blog on ECIPE, to make more friends?
Yes, so it's true, the EU has slowly been creating for itself an arsenal of trade policy instruments that are mostly defensive in nature. And they're mainly retaliatory policies against what can be considered coercive and unfair trade practices by partner countries. But a lot of these policies have a common underlying rationale, I think, which reflects growing concerns in the EU, but also all over the world, that countries are ill-equipped to handle the new types of challenges and inequities arising from global trade, right? And countries find themselves to be too dependent on others to meet their import needs. However, these defense policies are also making the EU more inward-looking because they're promoting producing more within the EU to reduce this dependence. This has an important consequence for EU's allies and partner countries, especially in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is because it weakens EU's existing trade relationships. So many of these trade defense instruments do not discriminate between allies and non-allies, right? They're applicable to all of EU's trade partners equally. So in addition to that, these new instruments can also prove harmful for the gains that the EU gets from being one of the largest exporters in the world. So what these defensive instruments are basically telling the world is that the EU is ready to forego some of its own benefits from trade and to alienate itself from its allies to ensure that its political and economic ambitions are met. In the current context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this has further consequences. So the first one is because the EU is willing to forego some of its gains from trade, it makes the EU more resolute in its endeavor to shift its trade away from Russia, right? It'll want to do that even though it has to buy gas, which is more expensive maybe. At the same time, to be able to shift away from Russia, the EU needs other trade partners that it can turn to, which means that the EU needs to form newer trade relationships and also grow its existing ones. That is, it needs more allies. So in order to counter the alienating effects that these defensive instruments have, the EU needs to also have in place more offensive instruments that enable the EU to make more friends. And I think an excellent example of a good offensive instrument is the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, given that it has the potential to not only strengthen commercial relationships between the two, but also cultural and political ones. Currently in the EU, I think the focus has been more on building its defensive instruments with the introduction of a number of regulations, such as the ones that you mentioned. But the EU has slowly also stepped up its efforts to build more friendships. And I think that's obvious in not only the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, but also, for instance, it's trying to work on its trade agreement with India, and which could, prove as a useful ally in the Asian continent against not just Russia, but also China. Finally, in order to make more friends, I think what the EU needs is not just defensive instruments, but also offensive ones, which take care of the changing relationship that the EU has with its partners. And I think a good way to do that is to have living documents as FTAs that take into account, as mentioned earlier, the changing relationship of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, the trade nature, as well as India and EU's trade relationship. So I think there needs to be a good balance between both defensive and offensive trade instruments.
Good. So in this context, the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement offers, as you mentioned, Vanika, opportunities for the regions, for the EU and for the Mercosur to gain market access on each other, but also to diversify their respective sources of imports. Maria, I now turn to you So what are, you have studied this, so what are these trade opportunities for the EU exports and imports?
Okay, I think, there is, as you are saying, we are now in a new environment, and these rocketing prices in food, energy, fertilizers really have a message of diversification, and Vanika has already mentioned that. Maybe the EU is even in need of further diversification because of its dependency to Russian and Ukraine in a way, and now it becomes much more difficult, right? And we are facing a lot of difficulties with inflation and so on. So diversification is very important for Europe. That's, I think, very clear now, maybe clearer than before, after this Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then on the Mercosur side, I believe that they have gone through a very difficult time with the COVID. Now, in the context of rising interests, they are also facing difficulties, inflationary pressures as the rest. But I believe what they need is more income in a way, and these agreements push growth upwards. So I feel it's always a good idea to be able to export more, produce more, employ more people. So that mechanism is very clear, right? And I think the agreement, and with this I'm coming a bit more into its content and what it facilitates more. I think it's interesting that both parties have been, in a way, quite sensitive about their own and each other's preferences, needs. And I feel it's nice that this agreement really, it has been defined as being ambitious but balanced at the same time. And of course, we know on the Mercosur's side, tariffs are pretty high by world standards. But these countries were demanding that we have to go slowly with this because this may have problems to begin with. So they have asked for a longer scheme in the reductions of tariffs. And what we find is that the agreement has been very careful in crafting those schemes so that tariffs would, most of them would be eliminated, but in the last year of implementation of the agreement in year 16. So you have a gradual reduction of the tariffs. And I think that's nice. In the Spanish study, we do that. We show how all these different years result in a growing pattern of trade, and at the same time, keeps protected for a while so that firms can adjust. So that's nice. On the EU side, then most of the tariffs disappear earlier in years 11, right? And then, of course, we have all these other, in a way, maybe obstacles to trade that are not just the tariffs, which are quite clear-cut what you have to pay. But then another thing, and Elitsa was mentioned that, right? That in the study for Spain, we analyze the contrasting patterns of Spain in the last year exporting to the other countries, to the world, with Mercosur countries. And despite all this cultural link that in a way are shared to a great extent by European countries, because I think it's true and it's important in this context that we are talking about to say that, well, really Latin America and Europe are much closer than other areas of the world. And that also helps to establish economic relationships, right? But we found that despite the cultural links, Spain was doing much better in other countries than in the Mercosur countries. And going deeper through econometric analysis that is able to capture some intangible obstacles, so to put it, we were realizing that it was much more difficult to diversify the exports, to really intensify those exports. And it's because there were those procedures of non-automatic licenses that Elitsa was mentioning earlier, and those were nightmares for exporters. So just to put an example, because it's much more than that, but then we have all this other world of the regulations, of the steps you have to take to be able to export or to invest in a different country, which really makes the life so difficult for exporters, particularly for small and medium enterprises, which I think this agreement is very clear that they will give this share point of information so that small, medium enterprises have it easier to identify how to do it. And I think that's they try to make a job to make the life easier for the smaller and medium enterprises, right? But I want to come to the point that we've been working in the agreement. I mean, the negotiations have managed to work on those non-tariff obstacles, sometimes needed because you need regulations, but other times not that clear whether they are good. They are a bit protectionist in a way. So you have a mixture that some of them are necessary, others it's not that clear whether they are necessary. But I think another important point is that EU, being sensitive, as I said earlier, to Mercosur preferences, has them to converge to international standards, the United Nations standards of trade. They have not imposed EU regulation. Of course, firms coming to Europe have to abide by those regulations if they want to sell in the EU market. But in this agreement, and I feel maybe this has not been always like that in the past, the non-tariff measures, the way in which regulations are proposed, is always a convergence to United Nations standards. And I feel that's good for the Mercosur in any case, because this is international and that brings them closer to a way of regulating that all countries in the world would understand. So in that way, I feel this has been negotiated, keeping in mind those interests, those preferences in both sides. And finally, let me add, as another possibility, extra way of finding trade opportunities, that we have been looking at e-commerce, because it's a component of the agreement. We don't have many studies that look at the impact of e-commerce. I think that's original from our study, because we look at how much e-commerce was conducted previous to the announcement of the political agreement in 2019. And we look at 6 months earlier, 6 months after that agreement, after that announcement, of the agreement. And we find there is a push for this e-commerce, depending on how you measure it, it can be 5% or 10%. So this is also another opportunity. The trade world is more complex, but they are carefully negotiating that, consumer security, also firm security through internet. And we find that only the announcement has an impact on that. So I think that's also another trade opportunity.
Great, that's a fantastic insight, Maria. I think we probably will all kind of agree that non-tariff barriers are a bit like fixed costs, and fixed costs have a high impact on SMEs. And a way to get more diversification and less dependency is to get more SMEs engaged in international trade, either as exporters or as importers. And it's definitely a tool that should be used to reduce or increase our resilience, let's say. But before we go into the association agreement, more like into the nitty-gritty of it, the association agreement is made of a trade and a political agreement. And Elitsa, in which way do you think that the political pillar of the association agreement is useful for a geopolitical EU in conflicts like the one we are living at the moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? What do you think?
Thank you for the toughest questions so far, I would say. What I would start with is simply looking into both the trade and the political component of the association agreement, and going over what are some of the values or some of the shared objectives that they both set. So especially when it comes to maybe starting with the trade part, it is one of the aspects is the promotion of joint values. So we're talking about sustainable development, strengthening of workers' rights, fighting climate change, environmental protection, as well as encouraging companies to act responsibly, and so on and so forth. But this is also sort of mimicked with very similar, but also with some additions, goals also on the political dialogue and cooperation side, where we talk about similar things, but more on the sort of the strategic aspects of cooperating over those aspects. So again, we're talking about environment, climate change, and biodiversity, digital development, including cybersecurity, but also international cooperation on security and organized crime. And of course, labor rights and corporate social responsibility. So there is, first of all, this sort of quite good parallel between the shared objectives that are set on both sides, and they reiterate each other. And what, for me, FTAs in general, but this one in particular, it really is about creating a framework through which issues of relevance to both sides can be tackled. So while, of course, there is, and Maria spoke about this, both cultural ties and very long-lasting relationship, sometimes when it comes to actually the institutional space, especially on the Mercosur side, it hasn't necessarily worked very well for resolving some of those issues. So I think that one of the things that will happen with a very sort of structured, first of all, it is a legal document. It is a legal commitment. It also ensures less backtracking. So what you have, first of all, is that it sort of brings together this sort of more formal institutional framework through which issues can be addressed. And that's not only for the issues that we're facing now with the war in Ukraine. This is also about forward-looking issues. So that's one point. But also here, it's quite interesting to mention, of course, with my academic hat and that burden coming in, that there is quite a bit of studies out there that talk about just the positives of the engagement of different civil servants, of different stakeholders, of economic operators on both sides through these different frameworks, which can bring what they call the process of socialization, where you just sort of go into believing those different values, and especially in moments of crisis. And this will not be the last one, but it's a horrible one. And it's a good opportunity to draw on your friends, as Vanika said. So there are a few other factors that do contribute to the conversation and that are probably more EU-Mercosur specific. And one of the things is, of course, those very long-standing economic and cultural ties, but also the fact that it's a region-to-region partnership that's been one of the important points right from the start, and that's key. And also while it might be decreasing in some areas, when it comes to FDI in particular, there is very strong interdependence between EU and Mercosur. So that definitely helps when at a time of crisis, when you want to make sure that that you have supporters to your cause. But it is a very tough geopolitical context, and when it comes to the impact of the war on energy and food supply chains, what we might see, or at least there is some commentators that think that this is a good time for the ratification of the agreement, that it provides one of those, again, to use that expression, windows of opportunity for an agreement to take place. Of course, there are also a lot of national factors, a lot of national elections coming up. So while maybe to finish on that point, while the war in Ukraine is definitely a major factor for some changes to speed up, we do have to remember that there are elections taking place also in Brazil this year, and this is probably going to be a more important one at this point. So this is really where we are at the minute.
Fantastic. So finally, let's move to our final theme of discussion for the event, which is the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement. We have discussed already, but let's go in detail. An agreement between the EU and Mercosur that has been negotiated, but not yet ratified. Maria, you have led a study, as I said before, commissioned by the Spanish government, that calculates the economic impacts of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement. It's a fantastic study. I recommend everyone to download it and read it. Can you give us a brief overview of the economic impacts for the EU and Mercosur?
Thank you, Oscar. Of course, we find that this agreement increases trade and investment. But what I would highlight is that at least I myself, I'm not interested in trade itself or investment itself, but the benefits of that. And We do find that the agreement will increase welfare, we create more jobs in all the countries involved. So then there is this effect of, making life more prosperous for the countries involved, which in the end I think is the main objective of an economist and of a trade agreement, right? To be more concrete, we do find that the agreement is not only about agriculture. We have already mentioned that, but once the agreement is implemented, services accounts for a larger share of trade than agricultural products. You have that beef in Brazil will increase production only by 1.6% because you have these quotas that have been carefully negotiated, and it's really a tiny increase. And the same applies to trade in agriculture. If that's not make it jump after the agreement, that's totally wrong. That's not the case, right? And to be more precise, we also find that for all the beef that would come from Mercosur to Europe after that, Brazil accounts for less than a half of that. So actually, most of the beef exports come from the other three countries, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And for several of them, it's a quite important export for their economies. For Brazil, it's important, but not that important because they have other things to trade, right? At the same time, we also find that lowering the barriers makes agricultural product going to Mercosur increase. Another thing is what happens with intra-industry European agriculture, which is not increasing after the agreement, but we export more to those countries. I think an important outcome that we obtain is that all the countries specialize in cleaner technologies. We do find that the increases in GDP that happens across the board, all the signatories benefit. And as I said earlier, the smallest countries benefit the most. That is the case for Paraguay and Uruguay. Then we find that those GDP increases are larger than the CO2 emissions that we measure from the agreement. So that is telling us that the agreement is making the economy specialize in cleaner energies because the GDP increases are larger than CO2 emissions. Of course, we highlight in the study that there are things beyond the numbers. I think a few of them have been raised here. They are very important. China, there's a strategy that the EU should follow to tackle with what is going on with China, and also other many aspects were mentioned, labor rights, and of course, I believe the commitments of Brazil to the Paris Agreement is more enforceable if they sign this agreement than before. By and large, we find it's a source of growth, a source of employment, a source of cleaner energies, and all the signatories benefit. I think that would be our main message.
Fantastic. Just let me say before we continue that for those who are listening to us at this moment, if you have questions, and I see a few hands have been raised, if you can please pop your question in the chat, and I will try to sneak it at the end of the event. Elitsa, a lot has been written about the potential negative impacts of the agreement. Maria has alluded to that on the environment and human rights. So another difficult question for you. What are these negative impacts? And more difficult, what can the EU and Mercosur do to offset them?
Thank you so much, Oscar. Thank you. You're keeping really the best ones for me. But I would say that we did have, at least I know the process very well, and I do want to share it with the audience today in terms of how it is that it's actually quite complex to identify what a trade agreement, what a trade agreement's impact might be on environmental and human rights issues. Since what you would have to do first, and that's what we had to do because we didn't have the finished agreement in front of us, is to assess what are the potential trade measures that might find their way into an agreement. So in relation to trading goods, trading services, investment, public procurement, and then what we call to screen, to identify which sectors might be most affected for each of those potential measures and which populations might be most vulnerable. So this is actually quite an extensive process where you start very wide, but then you narrow it down. But why is this important to say? Because it's not, first of all, in terms of how much the trade agreement can contribute positively or negatively to those issues, you're looking at a very sort of small sort of increment to the original baseline, to the original situation, both in the EU and in the Mercosur countries. So it's this specific space just above the signed agreement to an extent. And this is relevant because what we identified in this and in other studies that we do is that it's so much more important what the wider policy framework and in the countries is. And then two magic words that these days I talk about all the time, which are implementation and enforcement. So it might sound very nice on paper and be signed into the agreement, but it's really about putting the proper mechanisms in place to monitor those commitments on both sides, to make sure that they're implemented in line with the expectations of both sides and that they're enforced. And this is all done with the participation of stakeholders on both sides and but to return to the question in terms of what were the specific issues. So there was, and as now is in the public domain, there is a lot of discussion around a few very sort of key issues on both on the human rights and the environmental side. And I would focus on two in particular. So indigenous rights, and that's exactly where indigenous rights in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay was one of the issues where we found that an agreement may have sort of a moderate impact, in the sense that it is the likelihood of the impact is higher than for some of the other areas, and it will impact those groups disproportionately. And the situation here is that it's about agricultural expansion, and in particular increased investment that might reduce access to land rights from indigenous people in those three countries. And the situation is that it's more about the existing rules versus their implementation, because there is an existing framework which is meant to provide channels for redress and legal measures, but it's about how it is implemented in those three countries. At the same time, I do have to point out that as a result of the CG modeling that my team did, it was actually a very small increase in outputs that might result in such impact. So it's not in scale, it's actually quite moderate, but it is very, very serious for those specific vulnerable groups. So that's why it is important to look at. One of the other things that is quite common for countries with such sort of level of development is that there might be a move from moving from informal arrangements to formal work, which in itself is positive, but it might actually affect negatively some rural areas. And that's, again, one of the points that we make in the report, that it's about the accompanying measures that go with these changes. It's not necessarily the agreement per se that drives those changes, but what exists or what could be put in place on the ground. And there are a few. We definitely also noted a few potential positive effects in terms of access to healthcare services, particularly in rural Brazil and Paraguay. We also noted positive effects when it came to in general benefits accruing to women when it comes to gender issues. But in that regard, we also did note that when it comes to, and that's very common for, just in terms of the impact of trade on gender, is that women are often underrepresented in tradable sectors. So they are to gain less from the agreement, according to our studies, which is also important to note. And of course, we come to the most really the most discussed element of the agreement, and rightly so. And here is a good time to recommend ECIPE's event on this, on deforestation. So ECIPE has a very, very interesting event which brings together stakeholders, both from Mexico, Mercosur, and from the European Union, and from different parts of the supply chain, from very different perspectives. So really nailed this issue down. But what we have to say is that our study really tried very, very hard to look at environmental impacts from the different perspectives that this important question merits. And it is definitely remains a concern in many Mercosur countries, with the exception of Uruguay. And here, if we, as we did in the study, if you look at the longer term trends, there was an improvement in the situation in the beginning of the 21st century, especially starting from 2004 in Brazil. There was the introduction of a lot of policies in place to reduce deforestation, to try to decrease those deforestation rates, but also to combat some of the accompanying negative effects on the Amazon. But what we saw afterwards is that some of these were reversed after 2014, and it's a combination of factors. So that's one of the issues here. And I did try to alert that in the beginning, that when it comes to human rights, environmental issues, it's both, of course, the existing framework, but also wider economic conditions that have also been worsening in some of these areas. So a multitude of factors. It's very difficult to distinguish which part of the agreement in particular might be able to both affect positively and negatively this aspect. But our study pointed out to the fact that the TSD chapter is a good way to bring the Mercosur countries to the table, to try to incentivize them, to try to push them towards the effective implementation, not only of the Paris Agreement, but of similar commitments in terms of providing both again, returning to my favorite part of an FTA being a framework to bring together both sides. But also it would have to be paired with financial incentives, because that's one of the things that we hear from stakeholders in Mercosur, that it's often about also financial, not only financial, but financial and technical assistance to put those practices into place. So it is about implementation and enforcement, and in those two areas more so than any other part of the agreement.
Great. Thank you very much, Elitsa. That was a very clear and good answer. We're getting close to the end. So Maria, next question is for you. If you could be kind of relatively brief. So at the beginning of the event, we have mentioned the trade between the EU and Mercosur is more sophisticated than what people think. I think we have driven that point home. But how conducive is this agreement to the kind of trade that we see in the 21st century, trade that relies more on the flow of ideas, data, and services?
Okay. Well, one of our main findings is that this agreement will help to strengthen the already existing global value chains among Mercosur countries and European countries. And an important finding that we've checked at the product level and also at a more aggregate level with the CEE is that both of them specialize in higher value-added sectors. So they are moving up in the value-added chain, so to put it. And I think that's a very interesting finding, that this is strengthening those values chains, and at the same time they are making activities and operations that bring more value added to their own economies. Another important thing from our study is that we were able to check the real annexes, because we did it, it's quite recent, so they were already there. And we do go beyond trade, because these new trade agreements, they are much more than trade. So we are able to isolate the impact of multinationals. And that turns out to be very important, because it has been pointed out already, these links in foreign direct investment are very important between Europe and the Mercosur countries. And we also isolate the impact of public procurement, which again, it's an important point, because they will open, at least to begin with, the government level of public procurement. And the accumulation of these extra elements of complex trade agreements brings about a stronger impact for the agreement, which I think is important. If you focus on trade, you get part of the story. If you do more, then you get, in this case, a higher positive impact.
Good, and it's something I get from your study, which, as trade between the EU and Mercosur kind of evolves and is more based on services, those are less intensive on energy, less than kind of traditional agricultural goods. So in a way, you have this kind of double effect of increasing growth, and is less intensive on CO2 emissions because it's more modern, it's based on services, data, and so on. Good, fantastic. Now, before we finish, we're going to play a game. I'm going to ask the same question to my three panelists, and I'm going to start with Elitsa. And the question is, or the game is about overrated or underrated. So Elitsa, I'm going to ask you, what do you think? Is the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement underrated or overrated, and why? Give me your answer in 1 minute.
I would say underrated in one way, in the sense that it does provide a great tool to resolve common problems at a very difficult time. But overrated and how much it actually impact in terms of the scale of trade impacts, in terms of those little numbers that the CG modeling produces out. So both.
Good. Maria, your answer?
Well, I think this is an important agreement for both sides. It's huge in terms of what has already Europe, for example, has been the type of deals they have struck. Is the largest population ever, is the highest savings in tariffs. I think there is a lot of ground, for improvements. And above all, I think because we include more than trade, investment, multinationals, public procurement, then we find it's really a tool to make people's lives better. So underrated, I would say it's a huge tool. Good.
Vanika, the final question is for you. You have the final answer on the overrated, underrated game.
I would also say underrated, and I think it's because it provides a great avenue for the EU and Mercosur to re-energize their existing trade relationships. It gives them a chance to look at the changing composition of their trade, and then to make the necessary rules and regulations to get the maximum benefits out of their trade relationship. And then, as I mentioned in my previous answer, I think it's a great addition to the EU's offensive instruments and allows the EU to make more allies, which is never a bad thing to have.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We have one question from one of our from the audience, Jorge Riavoy, and I'm extremely sorry, Jorge, we didn't have, your question came at the very end, and we don't have much more time than an hour. But if you want to engage with us, please drop us an email, and we can answer, we can discuss, and I can also put you in touch with our panelists. So on that note, it's been a pleasure to talk about the EU and Mercosur relationship with our three exceptional speakers. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us and those who have engaged with us in social media and in the chat. And obviously, a big thanks to our team at ECIPE for making this event possible. We look forward to seeing you all in future events soon, and thank you very, very much. Goodbye.